But he did, Chester Arthur, after assuming the presidency after the assassination of James Garfield, did not have a very good run. The stalwarts in the Republican Party were mad at him for supporting Garfield's programs, so he lost support within his own supporters, so to speak, and had 4 pretty unproductive years. Didn't amount to much. You don't hear much about Chester Arthur, really, do you? Okay, that'll take us to another political election then, which is the election of 1884. And again, as far as your test is concerned, this open note test, you're going to want to take good notes so you can tell the difference in what happens in these elections, because basically these are going to be on the elections, okay? Now this is kind of an interesting scenario. Do you think Arthur wanted to run for his own term as president? Actually he did. So prior to the election of 1884, President Arthur knew in his mind that he would like to run for his own term. He wanted to kind of prove himself. It's always, I think, difficult to finish someone else's term. You always would like to have your own term as president. You know what I mean? To do what you want to do. And he wanted to do that too. So he knew that he wanted to run for his own term. What he didn't know at the time is he had contracted a fatal kidney condition. So even if he would have gained his party's nomination, which he didn't, and had been elected president, he would have not lived to serve his term. He's going to end up dying before what would have been that presidential term if he would have been elected. So even though he knew he wanted to run, he didn't know he had contracted a fatal kidney condition, and as a result, if President Arthur would have received his party's nomination and been elected president, he wouldn't have lived even to serve his own term. Well, this is kind of a weird deal. The stalwarts, and remember they were part of the Republican Party, right? They were so angry that they wouldn't support Arthur's nomination. So, just to be stubborn, they supported the half-breed's nomination for president. So the fellow we talked about yesterday, James G. Blaine, will again be a presidential candidate in this particular election. James G. Blaine will be the Republican candidate in this election. Now remember, he was being considered in the last election but didn't get picked because they picked the dark horse, James Garfield, right? So this time, half-breed James G. Blaine will get the nomination of the Republican Party. Now, think about this. The Republican Party is so split up and screwed up right now, isn't it? Half-breed stalwarts. So do you think every Republican was going to be behind James G. Blaine? No. So, what do?
Make another group.
Close. They don't quite make another political party, but another group who were unhappy with James Blaine's nomination formed another group called the Mugwumps. The Mugwumps. I don't know. They didn't, as Brady kind of alluded to, and it would probably be a good thought, they did not establish a political party, so they didn't nominate a candidate. Okay? But what did they threaten to do in this election because they didn't like James G. Blaine? Vote against it. Both are kind of correct. They threatened that they would vote for the Democratic candidate if James G. Blaine was going to be the Republican candidate. So you got a mess in the Republican Party. You got the stalwarts who believe one thing. You got the half-breeds who believe the other. You got the stalwarts mad at what Chester Arthur did, who support the nomination of their opposite half-breeds, James G. Blaine, and then you got a group of Republicans that are mad about the whole thing. They form a group called the Mugwumps, and they threaten to cast their Republican votes to the Democratic candidate. So this is just a mess of the century, okay? Well, the Democrats are just kind of smiling, are they not? Thinking this is awesome. So they nominate a former governor of New York by the name of Grover Cleveland for the presidency. Okay? So the Democrats are watching the stalwarts argue with their half-breeds, and they're arguing with the mugwumps, and the Republican Party's in disarray, and the Democrats are just back in the background kind of smiling, and they nominate a former governor of New York by the name of Grover Cleveland for the presidency. Now, despite all this political unrest and the problem within the Republican Party, prior to election night, it seems like this is going to be a pretty close election between Blaine and Cleveland. But on election eve, the night before the election, probably the best supporter, best friend of James G. Blaine makes a comment at a big function, and he calls the Democratic Party as rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Now think about this. Election's supposedly going to be kind of close. On election eve, the night before the election, James Blaine, the Republican candidate, his biggest supporter and friend, says in front of a lot of people at a function, he said the Democratic Party are rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Now remember, this election was supposed to be close. Who did that offend?
Drinkers.
No. Now, seriously, I want you to think about this. No, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. That's what he calls the Democratic Party. I don't know if we have any.
He offended the South, didn't he?
No. Rum doesn't offend anybody, does it? Rebellion doesn't offend anybody. What does Romanism offend? What? And what kind of? What are the best known, quote, Romans in America at the time? Close, but what religion are Italians?
Oh, Catholics.
Catholics.
Yeah.
So he offends Catholics, big time. Now, folks, are there Democratic Catholics like he criticized? But are there also Republicans that are Catholics? If I went to the Catholic Church here in Worland, anybody in here go to the Catholic Church in Worland? I'll bet 99% of the people that go to that church are Republicans in this area. So what happens is this well-known supporter of James G. Blaine ticks off the entire Republican Catholic community, and do they vote for the Republican Blaine? No, they vote for the Democrat Cleveland. So all these Republican Roman Catholics are so upset with that comment that they vote Democrat in this election. So, in what was going to be a close race, and was fairly close, Grover Cleveland wins the election of 1884. Now look at the electoral vote. 219 to 182. Pretty close. And because of his victory in the election of 1884, 219 to 182, Grover Cleveland becomes the 22nd president of the United States. This fellow right here. Does he look a lot like this fellow right here? Yeah, because it's the same fellow. He's going to be elected, defeated, and elected again. So he's going to be the 22nd. Everybody counts differently. Okay, let's look at something real quickly. Okay, look at this. 22nd, right?
Yeah.
23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45. Is Donald Trump the 45th President of the United States? He is. So Grover Cleveland is going to be the 22nd President of the United States and the 24th President of the United States. We'll get to that later.
That could be a trick.
So there's only been 44 men serve as President of the United States, but Trump is the 45th President.
Wow.
Just so you know. All right, now, This was have we had many Democratic wins in the last few elections? This is the first Democratic win in 28 years, 5 elections. You know who the last Democrat to win the White House was? To serve in the White House? Win it from here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Clear back to James Buchanan. Democrat, Republican. Oh, this guy, I gotta rephrase that. Democrat, Democrat, but he didn't get elected. He assumed the presidency, right?
Yeah.
Republican. Or excuse me, Democrat. So it went all the way back to here. Okay? So 28 years, 5 elections. Why doesn't that make sense? 5 times 4 is 20. Because we had 2 presidents that were killed during that period of time and replaced by vice presidents. Okay? Now, during the Grover Cleveland administration, I should say the first one, 2 very important pieces of legislation, in other words, 2 very important laws were passed at the time. And they both will deal with problems that we've talked about. The first one was the Presidential Succession Act of 1886. The Presidential Succession Act of 1886. What do you think that had to do with, Logan? Presidential Succession Act of 1886. We've had 2 things happen that made a big change in our country. That was 2 assassinations. So what's the Presidential Succession Act?
Would it be to protect them?
No. Elizabeth?
Wouldn't it be if the president dies, who's going to take over?
Well, we already know that, but if the president and
The vice
the
president.
vice president die, who's next? We didn't have that in act until 1886. In other words, of course, we've never had to deal with that even to today, but the point was, yeah, we've had 2 instances in pretty short history here in which presidents were assassinated or died in office or whatever, in which the vice president took over. Well, what would happen if the president and vice president, today's world, were on the same airplane and it crashed? Who next would be in line? So that's what it did. It established the order in which. Now, how'd they do it in those days? The next in line would be the next office that was created. So you had president, vice president. What was the next? Secretary of State. Is that what the succession is today? No. Right now it's the Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
That's been changed. But in those days, it would have been President, Vice President, Secretary of State in the order in which that cabinet was formed way back in the George Washington days. But as we got into modern history, they revised that and have a specific order now.
Who's Speaker of the House right now?
Nancy Pelosi.
Really bad.
So depending on your political view,
She's at the
there we go. But does everybody know what the Presidential Succession Act of 1886 did? It simply stated the order in which people would ascend to the presidency. Be president, vice president, then in the order that they were established way back in history. In this case, it had been Secretary of State. What's that?
Let's hope nothing bad happens.
Well, yeah, we hope. Now, the second piece of legislation that was passed was the Electoral Count Act of 1887. What's that going to deal with? Well, the problem we had. What problem did we have in that election of 1876? We had 4 states sent in 2 sets of returns, right? And we went through that whole mess and tried to get that figured out. What did we do? We appointed a president. That ain't going to work. So what the Electoral Count Act of 1887 stated that if a state sent in more than 1 set of returns, the set that the governor approved would be the set they would count. So if Alabama sent in 2 set of returns and you and I were the ones figuring that out, we'd say, oh, 2 set of returns. We would get a hold of the governor of Alabama and say, okay, I got 2 set of returns here. Which one do you want us to count? And he would pick the one, or she would pick the one they would count. That's what the Electoral Count Act of 1887 did. Was if 2 sets of returns were ever sent in again, the governor of the state in which the returns came from would pick the set he or she wanted.
Have you ever had that happen?
No, not since. It was a good law, okay? All right, that'll take us to another election. The election of 1888. Try to keep these apart. Well, who are the Democrats going to nominate for president? Same, no. Oh, same person as, President Cleveland? Perfect, yep. So the Democrats nominate President Cleveland for re-election. The Republicans nominate Benjamin Harrison, who is the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. Remember, he's the one that gave his inauguration speech in the rain and caught pneumonia and died like 30 days afterwards, and John Tyler replaced him. Okay, so William Henry Harrison's grandson, Benjamin Harrison, is going to be nominated by the Republican Party to run against President Cleveland and the Democratic Party. Now, this is interesting because for the first time in history, you're going to have a person get more popular votes but lose the election. Okay? Now, we can't count 1876 when Samuel J. Tilden got more because he wasn't elected. There was nobody elected, they were appointed. So the first time in history, Grover Cleveland's going to have more than 100,000 more popular votes than Benjamin Harrison. But he's not going to get the electoral votes. Harrison is going to have 233 electoral votes to Cleveland's 168. So for the first time in history, the person that gets the most popular votes loses the election to the other person by electoral vote. We can't say that in 1876 with Tilden because there was no election, they appointed. Okay. So, Cleveland wins the popular vote by over 100,000 votes, but Harrison wins the electoral votes 233 to 168. And he becomes the 23rd president of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. 233 to 168. Now, this is going to be pretty good for Harrison because who's going to control Congress during his presidency? His short presidency? No, his presidency. Who's going to control the Republicans? That's going to be good for him. All right, we're next going to talk about a profile on Benjamin Harrison. Interesting dude. Profile on Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was born in 1833 on his grandfather's farm in Ohio. Benjamin Harrison was born in 1833 on his grandfather's farm in Ohio. A lot of Ohio presidents, that's right. Now, Benjamin Harrison was named after his great-grandfather, who, by the way, was one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence. Okay? So Benjamin Harrison was named after his great-grandfather, who was an original signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Harrison was one of 10 children in his family. He was the second oldest of 10. He had one older sibling and 8 younger siblings. He was the second oldest of 10. Well, what's that?
Did you say Constitution or
Declaration of Independence. So, he's the second of 10 children born. He goes through elementary school, goes through high school, graduates, and goes to Farmers College in Farmers Hill, Ohio, for 3 years. So after high school, he attends Farmers College, which is not about farming. It's the name of the college. Farmers College in Farmers Hill, Ohio, for 3 years. And his freshman year at Farmers College, he meets his future wife, Caroline Scott. And during his freshman year at Farmers College, he meets his future wife, Caroline Scott. Well, they get married while they're in college, and they eventually have 2 children, a boy and a girl. They eventually get married while he's in college, and they will have 2 children, a boy and a girl. And then he transfers from Farmers College, right? He only went there 3 years, and he goes to Miami of Ohio University. Miami of Ohio. Anybody know the most famous football quarterback in the NFL that graduated from Miami of Ohio? Playing right now, starting quarterback in the NFL, won a couple Super Bowls. Ben Roethlisberger. Any Steeler fans in here? Yeah, Big Ben Roethlisberger is a Miami of Ohio University graduate. But Harrison doesn't get a degree in pro football. Harrison gets a degree in law and becomes a lawyer. Harrison has gone to college to earn a law degree, which he does from Miami of Ohio University, and he becomes a lawyer. Benjamin Harrison was a very religious man. He taught Sunday school classes throughout his life. He became the deacon of his local Presbyterian church. Very, very religious man, Benjamin Harrison. Taught Sunday school almost his entire life, and was the deacon at his local Presbyterian church. Now, this is the time where we go into